His own mother paid $500,000 to erase his unborn child. For 5 years, Chicago's deadliest mob boss believed the love of his life simply walked away. He built an empire on blood and silence, never knowing he had a 5-year-old daughter hiding in the same city. But when a heroic stray puppy leads him to their crashed car, just seconds before it explodes, the truth comes out. Prepare for the ultimate mafia revenge story, where the biggest betrayal comes from the matriarch's own sitting room. 11 o'clock at night. Chicago's Interstate 94 so stretched out like a long, dark memory, drowning under a violent November storm. The rain hit the asphalt hard, sounding like bullets, turning the empty road into a black mirror that swallowed up the headlights. You know how it feels when the weather matches the heaviness in your own chest. That was the mood tonight. 3 heavy, armored black vehicles tore through the wind in perfect formation, their dark windows reflecting nothing but falling water and ghosts. Inside the middle car, the air was freezing. It was the kind of suffocating silence that only hangs around men who carry the weight of taking human life, and sitting right there in the back seat, drowning in his own silence, was Lorenzo Moretti. Lorenzo was 37 years old, but if you looked into his cold blue eyes, you would see a man who had lived twice that long. He wore a sharp black coat over a dark shirt, his jaw rough with a shadow of stubble. He just stared through the wet glass, not even blinking. Sometimes holding onto emptiness is the only way a broken heart knows how to keep beating. He had been completely hollow ever since Elena walked away 5 years ago, taking his soul with her. He had just crushed another big deal with the New York crime syndicate at the harbor. Another huge victory, yet another meaningless win in a lifetime of blood and regret. Lorenzo ignored it all, completely numb, while Dante Marino sat up front, his sharp face glowing under the pale light of a phone screen. Up front, 40-year-old Marco Bellini gripped the wheel with 20 years of unquestioned loyalty. The wipers were fighting a losing battle against the heavy downpour. Without warning, Marco slammed his heavy boot onto the brakes. The massive vehicle shrieked as the tires slid across the soaking road. The cars trailing behind them stopped short, flooding the inside of Lorenzo's car with a blinding white light. Dante grabbed his gun, cursing into the sudden chaos. But what they saw wasn't an ambush. Frozen in the bright glare was something incredibly fragile, a tiny German shepherd puppy, drenched to the bone and shaking. We often expect danger in the dark, but sometimes life places helpless innocence right in our path just to remind us that we still have a beating heart. The little dog stood in the freezing rain, staring right at the massive grille of the car like it was his destiny. Dante tightened his grip on his weapon. He warned Lorenzo that rival mobs used decoys and begged him to keep driving. Lorenzo stayed completely silenced, his heavy eyes drifting toward the front glass. Dante raised his voice, telling the driver to run the dog over because a mafia boss never stops on an open road. Lorenzo just raised one hand, a quiet command to wait. Have you ever noticed how the smallest act of courage changed course of a life? That puppy didn't run away. He stumbled forward through the mud, slipping and fighting the wind, until he reached the heavy back door. He stood on his weak back legs and rested his muddy paws right on Lorenzo's window. Lorenzo slowly turned his head, and the raging storm outside seemed to go completely dead. The tiny animal locked eyes with the terrifying mob boss. Those big, wet eyes were drowning in sorrow, staring right through the thick bulletproof glass and finding a wounded piece of Lorenzo's soul that he had buried years ago. There was zero fear in that puppy. It was just a silent, desperate cry for mercy. Compassion is a funny thing. My friends, you can bury it under a mountain of dirt, but it never truly dies. Something painful cracked open inside Lorenzo's chest. Dante yelled at him to ignore it, swearing that it wasn't their problem. Lorenzo did not say a single word. He pulled the heavy door handle, letting the freezing rain scream into the car, and stepped out into the brutal darkness. The storm punished Lorenzo the second his leather shoes met the flooded road. The freezing water instantly ruined his coat, like washing down his rough face, like the bitter tears he had sworn never to cry again. He did not care about the cold. He just stood there like a statue, completely captivated by the shivering little soul at his feet. The animal was horrifyingly thin up close, just skin and sharp bones covered in thick mud. Every weak breath puffed out into the icy air like white smoke. It is often in our lowest, most battered states that we discover who truly cares for us. Without a second thought for his pride, the most dangerous man in the Chicago underworld dropped down onto one knee right into the dirty puddle. The tiny, broken creature stayed right there, waiting for a savior. The little dog refused to give up. He crawled through the thick mud, clamped his tiny teeth onto the cuff of Lorenzo's trousers, and pulled. He yanked once, twice, putting every ounce of his shivering weight into the effort, dragging the mob boss toward the pitch-black tree line. That edge dropped off into a dark, unseen valley. "Boss, get back in the car right now." Dante's voice sliced through the heavy downpour, sharp and frantic. Car doors slammed in rapid succession as 4 bodyguards spilled from the third vehicle, their weapons drawn, sweeping the endless rain for shadows. Dante marched forward, his thick leather coat already ruined by the storm. "This is exactly the kind of trap Vanetti would set for us," he snapped. "You and I have seen it 100 times. We build massive walls to stay safe, but trust is always broken by the quietest things. Think of a wounded animal on the road dying, and you stop. There's mud. Sniper drops you from the height." Lorenzo did not blink. His cold gaze stayed locked on the trembling puppy. The tiny creature was choking itself, whimpering desperate sounds between each violent tug. Those wet brown eyes stared up at the mafia boss with a pure, raw urgency, carrying a heavy weight that only Lorenzo seemed to understand. Slow and deliberate, Lorenzo stood up to his full 6'2" frame. His coat dripped black water, and his blue eyes were colder than the freezing rain. "Marco," he said, his voice flat and absolutely final, "you and 2 men are coming with me." Marco stepped up immediately, gun ready. Dante blocked their path, begging to join. Life teaches us this over and over. Sometimes you just have to follow the pain to find the truth. "I simply do not trust this," Dante insisted. Lorenzo slowly turned his head, and a freezing silence stretched between the 2 men. "You stay here with the cars," Lorenzo ordered. "If this is a trap, I need someone watching our only exit. That is you." For a split second, a strange shadow crossed Dante's face. It might have been simple frustration, or a much darker poison, but it vanished before anyone could read it. "And he muttered. Lorenzo turned away. The puppy was already dashing ahead into the gloom, splashing through deep puddles before vanishing into the thick pine trees. Marco hit the switch on his heavy flashlight, cutting a path through the dark woods. 2 guards followed closely. It is funny how deceptions works. The people who warn us about the traps are often the ones holding the wire. Back on the wet asphalt, Dante stood perfectly still, watching until the black storm completely swallowed his boss. Then, moving slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. "Step into the deep woods with me for a second." The atmosphere shifted instantly. The violent roar of the highway wind died down, turning the rain into a soft whisper against the dead leaves. Narrow flashlight beams sliced through the shadows, catching jagged roots and wet tree trunks. Lorenzo felt a deep ache radiating through his chest. It was not the cold panic of an ambush. It was an old, heavy sorrow he had spent years trying to bury, a feeling he had locked away back when he still had a heart to break. Up ahead, the dog abruptly froze at the lip of a steep drop. We all have that one ghost we refuse to name until it forces us to look. The terrified animal stood paralyzed on the edge of the cliff. Its ears were pinned back, ribs shivering violently. It made no sound at all. It just stared down into the endless black pit where the earth vanished. Marco pointed his heavy flashlight toward the edge. The bright beam illuminated a violent skid mark burned into a forgotten service road. The thick steel guardrail had been ripped open and shredded like wet tissue paper, the jagged metal pointing out into the void. Lorenzo felt in his pulse hammer against his ribs. Far down in the crushing dark, a piece of crushed metal reflected the light. The beam drifted down the steep slope and landed on a horrifying sight. A white SUV was resting completely upside down, 15 meters below them, sinking into a grave of thick mud. Sometimes the deepest scars are hidden just off the main road. The heavy, visualized glass had exploded into a million jagged pieces, shining like crushed diamonds in the mud. The driver's door was ripped backward, dangling off a single bent hinge. Hot grey smoke drifted up from the crushed oxygen block, hissing violently as the freezing rain struck the boiling metal. For a few agonizing seconds, Lorenzo forgot how to breathe. The tragic reality set in. Whoever was bleeding out inside that steel cage had been trapped there for hours, long enough for a helpless animal to claw its way up a cliff, find a highway, and physically halt a mafia convoy in the dead of night. Then, the tiny dog let out a cry that would haunt Lorenzo until his final days. It was not a normal animal sound. It was a shattering, human-like scream of absolute loss. Grief is the one language every living creature speaks fluently. The little dog did not hesitate. He threw his tiny, battered body over the jagged edge of the ridge, scrambling down through the freezing mud toward the smoking wreckage. "Boss, wait." But Lorenzo was already gone. He went over the drop in one desperate motion, half running, half tearing through the unforgiving slope. His shoes found zero traction. Dead branches lashed his face, tearing his skin, while a sharp root ripped his heavy coat. Halfway down the drop, his heel caught wet leaves. He slammed down hard, dark mud and bitter rainwater flooding his mouth. He did not even pause. He forced himself up, ignoring Marco yelling some frantic warning from the cliff above. All Lorenzo could hear was the roar of the storm and the violent hammering of his own pulse. Picture this. The rain is coming down like a judgment. The smell then hit Lorenzo long before he reached the overturned vehicle. It was gasoline, thick, raw, and sharp enough to the back of his throat. A dark puddle was spreading slowly through the mud beneath the wreck, mixing with the rain into a sickening sheen. And you and I both know what that means. One single spark. One piece of overheated metal, and it is all over. Lorenzo skidded to a halt exactly 3 meters from the disaster. 20 years surviving the worst corners of Chicago screamed at him turn back to save himself. But he stepped closer. Instead, a tiny stray puppy had already reached the SUV, scratching desperately at the shattered glass, crying out in a high, broken way that simply shatters your heart. Lorenzo raised his flashlight, cutting a sharp beam through the twisted metal. That was the moment he saw it. A woman's hand, pale and fragile, hanging down from the inverted roof. Her fingers were relaxed, swaying with the rhythm of the falling rain. On her finger sat a plain silver band, no diamonds, no engraving. It was the simple kind of ring someone keeps to hold onto a memory they cannot afford to lose. Lorenzo felt his grip tremble. He had held a hand just like that once, in a lifetime that felt centuries away. Sometimes the past we run from is just waiting for us in the wreckage. He forced himself forward, slipping in the thick mud, and dropped to his knees beside the shattered window. The entire cabin was a pure nightmare of crushed seats and broken glass. The woman was suspended upside down in the driver's seat, held only by her seatbelt. Her dark hair hung toward the earth like a heavy, wet curtain, hiding her face. A line of deep red traced a painfully slow path from her temple, falling drop by drop onto the ruined ceiling below her. She was entirely still. Then, from somewhere deep in that steel tomb, Lorenzo heard it. It was a sound so fragile it was almost swallowed by the roaring storm. A child was crying. Without a single hesitation, Lorenzo drew his sidearm in one smooth motion. He did not aim it. He flipped the weapon over, turning the heavy steel grip into a hammer, and he swung hard. The rear window exploded inward instantly, sending a shower of safety glass scattering across the inverted roof like crushed ice. The puppy darted away from the noise, but instantly rushed right back, whining in distress only. On Mudstee's slope, Marco yelled through the rain, "Boss, get out of there. That fuel line is bleeding out." But Lorenzo was deaf to the warning, peering into the jagged frame of the air inside reeked of raw fuel, blood, and something else. Something painfully familiar that his brain refused to process, and there she was. A little girl strapped into a car seat in the back, suspended upside down. Her tiny frame trembled violently against the tight straps. She could not have been more than 5 years old. Her pink dress was torn at the edges, stained dark with mud, and a line of red wept from a cut on her small elbow. The little girl clutched a battered stuffed bear, pressing it to her chest like it was the only safe thing left on earth. With one trembling hand, she reached out, pulling weakly at the woman in the front. "Mommy," she sobbed, her sweet voice totally shattered. "Please, please." Something old and heavy inside of Lorenzo simply broke apart. You see, true love makes us entirely blind to our own pain. He swept the jagged glass aside with his sleeve and forced himself headfirst through the window. He twisted his shoulders, snagging his thin flesh on a sharp edge of torn steel. He felt absolutely nothing. He crawled across the inverted ceiling on his elbows, letting the broken glass bite into his bare palms, dragging himself forward until he reached the unmoving driver. The woman's dark hair covered her features like a veil. With a shaking hand, Lorenzo reached out and gently pushed the wet strands away. In that freezing cabin, the entire universe stopped spinning. A choking sound ripped from his throat. It was her. Elena, 5 agonizing years vanished in a single heartbeat. 5 years of freezing beds and ruthless boardroom wars. 5 years of pretending he had forgotten the music of her laugh. Time never heals our deepest wounds. It merely buries them until a storm washes the dirt away. And here she was, bleeding, unconscious, suspended in a crushed metal box at the bottom of a muddy ravine. It was the exact same gentle face he had mourned, the exact same delicate scatter of freckles across the bridge of her nose. We spend our lives trying to outrun the past, only to find it waiting at the end of the road. Those were the lips Lorenzo had kissed 1,000 times in a life he had long buried. A cold drop of rain fell from his hair onto her cheek, then another, and then something warmer that he would never admit was a tear. For the first time in years, Lorenzo Moretti, the most feared man in Chicago, lost control of his iron mask. Boss, Marco's voice cut through the storm with heavy panic. I can hear the engine cracking. It is going to blow. Get out of the vehicle. But Lorenzo was frozen. Then a tiny voice broke the heavy silence. Mister. He turned his head slowly. A little girl stared at him through the crushed seats, her small face smeared with mud, her wide eyes frozen in pure terror. She clutched a dirty stuffed bear to her chest. Mister, are you going to help my mommy? In the exact second, the heart of a ruthless boss stopped beating. Looking back at him, framed by lashes wet with tears, were two impossibly familiar eyes, ice blue, pale as a winter sky, the exact same eyes he stared into every morning for 37 years, his own eyes, staring from the innocent face of a child he never knew existed. Those eyes, he breathed, the words tearing out of his throat. It cannot be. Sometimes life offers you redemption, just as everything is about to burn. Lorenzo forced himself back into motion. There was no time to think. The metallic shriek beneath the hood grew louder, squealing like a boiling kettle. The thick stench of raw gasoline violently stung his burning eyes. Sweetheart, look at me, he said. His voice came out softer than he had ever heard it. I am going to get you out. Can you be brave for me? The little girl nodded, her lower lip trembling. She squeezed her bear tighter. True strength is not about how hard you strike, but how gently you hold what matters. Lorenzo reached out, his gloved hands finding the jammed buckle. The twisted harness refused to give. He pulled a folding knife from his coat, the blade snapping open with a click. Instead of taking a life, this weapon would save one. He sliced through the heavy strap in a single motion. The girl dropped 2 feet in his arms. She felt impossibly light against his chest, twisting his body to shield her from the jagged, broken glass. He pushed backward out of the ruined window and into the freezing rain. Marco shouted a warning as the vehicle shifted, its metal groaning. His rough hands reached down, pulling the little girl from Lorenzo, holding her fragile body against his heavy armor like she was spun glass. He yelled for his boss to get out, but Lorenzo froze. Sometimes the choices to trap us are the ones that make us human. A tiny puppy was still inside the wreckage, crawling upside down, pressing its shaking body against Elena. It barked a sharp, desperate plea for help. Lorenzo did not hesitate. He dragged himself right back into that metal tomb. Elena was trapped. The seat belt twisted tight, locking her ribs against the crushed frame. He pulled his curved blade, sliding the cold steel carefully between the fabric and her chest, starting the slow, agonizing cut. The first strap snapped. The second fought back, forcing his blade to drag through the thick nylon. Under the hood, a small, ugly pop sounded out the quiet noise that precedes disaster. Life is often like that. The softest light warnings come right before the blast. Marcus Gromais screamed from the mud. The final thread gave way, and Elena fell into Lorenzo. He pulled her over his shoulder, scooped up the terrified puppy, and lunged through the window. He barely cleared the metal when the world ripped open. A wave of orange fire and boiling air slammed into his spine, tossing them like discarded toys. Midair, pure instinct took over. Lorenzo curled his entire body around Elena and the dog to absorb the impact as they violently hit the wet earth. When the spinning stopped, Lorenzo lay still on top of her. His dark coat was smoking, and a heavy ringing drowned out the storm. His back screamed in agony, but he refused to move until he felt the faint rise of her chest.
One breath, then another. Alive.
True strength isn't about how hard you can fight. It is how much you will endure for someone you care for. Behind them, the ruined vehicle burned like a pyre in the rain. A little girl's voice shattered the night, crying for her father while fighting in it rose. Lorenzo Fushtarousos pushed himself up from the dirt. Mud and cold rainwater ran down his bruised face. He looked straight into the child's terrified eyes, softening his voice completely. "Your mommy is going to be okay," he promised her. The little girl stared at him, hot tears carving paths through the cold rain on her cheeks. Then, in a fragile whisper that barely cut through the hiss of burning metal, she asked the question that finally shattered his iron heart. "Mister, who are you? And why do you look exactly like me?" Lorenzo could not find the breath to answer. Beside his knee, the puppy crawled toward Elena, licking her limp fingers, letting out a soft, shuddering whimper. Moscow scrambled down the steep slope. The nearest hospital is St. Mary's. 20 minutes if I push it. The guards moved to lift Elena onto a makeshift stretcher of canvas. "No hospital," Lorenzo commanded. Marco froze. "Boss, no public hospital," Lorenzo repeated, his voice cold and flat as dead iron. "Welcome to the midnight hour. You and I know how the real world works, don't we? Hospitals report car crashes. Papers get filed and names end up on ledgers." Lorenzo understood this. He pulled that shivering, rain-soaked puppy tight against his coat. If someone was hunting the woman in his arms, he needed her completely invisible. He gave the order. "Call the doctor. Get him to the estate immediately." Up on the ridge, Dante stood with his hands buried deep in his pockets. He just watched the stretcher, the child, and then Lorenzo. He didn't say a single word. He didn't have to. The quiet, cold calculation in that stare was loud enough to deafen. The lesson here is simple. Silence is never truly empty. It is usually just filled with the truths we are too afraid to say out loud. Lorenzo walked past him, the gravel crunching under his boots. Get in the car," he ordered. "We are going home." That 40-minute drive back to Lake Forest felt like a lifetime. The storm chasing them every single mile. The Moretti property sat hidden behind massive iron gates and ancient oak trees. Tonight, the sprawling mansion looked like nothing more than a desperately needed place to hide. The staff was waiting when the vehicles pulled up. Lorenzo carried the unconscious little girl himself, her tiny head resting on his shoulder. Sometimes these things we carry in this life are the things that weigh the absolute least. Marco followed with Elena, her breath shallow and ragged. That little puppy stuck right to Lorenzo, refusing to be left behind in the dark. Dr. Hartwell walked in at 1 in the morning. He's for silver-haired, plastered from the rain. He had patched up the Moretti family for over 20 years, knowing the golden rule of this house. Do the work and never ask questions. He tended to Elena on the downstairs velvet sofa. Half an hour ticked by before he stood up and removed his glasses. "A mild concussion," he said in a low hush. 2 cracked ribs, deep cuts. She is lucky. In life, we rarely appreciate the narrow margins of our survival until the danger is gone. Whoever pulled her from that wreck bought her 50 years.
"And the little girl?"
Lorenzo asked, his voice tight. "Scratches and shock," Hartwell replied.
Asleep in her mother." He paused. "She also keeps asking about a dog."
Lorenzo looked down. That tiny puppy was curled at Elena's feet, his chin resting on her ankle. His eyes were shut, but his ears twitched with every breath she took. "He stays with them," Lorenzo commanded. Just then soft footsteps creaked on the grand staircase. Lorenzo turned. Isabella Moretti was coming down slowly, her hand sliding along the polished wood. She wore a black velvet robe, her silver hair pinned back. At 64, she still moved like the queen of a cold empire, back straight, chin high, calculating every step. You see, true power never rushes. It simply waits for the world to bow. "Lorenzo, who on earth?" she started, but the words died in her throat. Her gaze locked onto the injured woman on the sofa. and every drop of color washed out of her face. Isabella's knuckles turned white on the banister.
Her lips parted. The words vanished. Her wide eyes
Shifted to the armchair, landing on the little girl sleeping with a teddy bear beneath her chin. Isabella grabbed her chest, swaying on her feet. Lorenzo thought she might actually collapse. He just watched her, cold, patient, reading every muscle twitch on her face. "Mother," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Is there something you have not told me?" The truth always leaves a shadow, no matter how hard we try to bury it. Isabella's eyes welled with tears. She opened her mouth, closed it, and walked into the dark without a word.
Across the foyer, hidden behind a carved archway, Dante held a phone to his ear. "It is me," he whispered into the receiver. "He has found her."
The boss found her. Dante finished his... Hours later, Sophia fluttered her eyes open. She stared at a ceiling she did not recognize. It was a soft cream color, with white molding curling around the edges like frosting. A massive chandelier hung above, its crystal teardrops catching the morning light and throwing tiny rainbows across the room. She blinked slowly, trying to piece it together, the heavy rain, the loud crash, her mother refusing to wake up. That strange man with eyes exactly like her own. She sat up too fast, wincing as her bandaged elbows stung. A child's memory is fragile, often storing the exact trauma we pray they forget. She looked down, realizing she was wearing a clean white nightgown, resting in a bed bigger than her entire bedroom back home. A tiny shift at the foot of the mattress made her gasp. Bandit lifted his weary head from his paws, and the second their eyes locked, the puppy's tail started to wag. It was slow at first, then faster, thumping against the duvet. "Bandit," Sophia whispered. She snoozed across the sheets and threw her arms around his neck. He licked her cheek twice before pressing his warm forehead against hers. Sometimes the deepest comfort we find comes from souls that cannot speak a single word. They stayed like that, breathing together in the quiet room. "Where is Mommy?" she whispered into his soft fur. The dog could not answer, but he hopped out off the edge of the bed and looked back at her. His ears pricked up, waiting. Sophia slid down the mattress, its bare toes sinking into the thick wool rug. She found her stuffed bear sitting on a nearby armchair. Someone had tied a fresh ribbon around its worn neck. She tucked the bear under her arm and padded into the massive hallway. The space was enormous. Cold marble floors stretched beneath tall doors with brass handles. Dark paintings of stern-looking people lined the walls, their eyes following her every step. She turned the handle of the first door and peeked inside. There she was. Mommy. Elena was tucked beneath a heavy quilt, her dark hair fanned across the pillow. A small bandage rested on her temple. In the corner, a strange nurseess sat quietly, knitting. Her mother's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. Sleep is often our only true shield against the reality of pain. "She is sleeping." "Sweetheart," the nurse whispered. The doctor gave her medicine, the nurse explained. Sophia gave a solemn nod and closed the door without a sound. She and Bandit continued their walk. A grand staircase led down to a marble foyer. She gripped the railing with both hands, just like her mother taught her, counting the steps. 18, the 24th, and curiosity is a funny thing. It often overrides our deepest fears. At the bottom, she picked a hallway at random and pushed open a heavy wooden door. She froze, her mouth falling open. It was a massive library. Shelves climbed all the way to the towering ceiling, requiring rolling ladders to reach the top. A warm fire crackled on the far wall. Sitting right there, swallowed by a deep leather armchair, was the man with the sad blue eyes. A cup of coffee steamed in his grip. Lorenzo stared out the rain-spattered glass, His mind lost miles away. We have all had those heavy moments, have we not? Staring out a window, wishing we could rewrite our past.
Sophia tilted her head. Mister, is this your house? It is so pretty. Lorenzo snapped his head around, nearly spilling his drink.
He had not heard her footsteps. He had not heard anything for the past hour, buried under his own regrets. He cleared my throat. Yes, it is my house. Sophia walked to the armchair across from him and climbed right into it, and it curled up at her feet. My name is Sophia, she announced, smoothing the nightgown over her knees. I am 5. What is your name? Lorenzo, he answered. The little girl scrunched her nose. Lorenzo, she said. That is hard to remember. Can I call you Mr. Lowe? A strange sound rumbled from deep inside his chest, a noise he had not made in years, almost a laugh. You can call me whatever you want, he said. Sophia smiled. Then she stopped and looked at him. Mr. Lowe, she said softly, why are your eyes the exact same as mine? Lorenzo froze. It is terrifying when a child's innocence exposes our buried secrets. Mommy says my eyes came from my daddy, Sophia continued. But my daddy died before I was born. The coffee cup trembled in his hand. Upstairs, Elena woke. For a long moment she did not move. Her eyes traced the unfamiliar ceiling, the heavy curtains pulled against a grey sky, the faint smell of lavender. None of it made any sense. Reality crashed in. Her battered body sent the brutal truth in a single wave of pain. Her fractured ribs, the throbbing temple, the deep ache of dark bruises. The accident, she gasped, throwing herself upright too fast. The room tilted violently. She gripped the headboard, breathing through clenched teeth. Then she looked at the walls. She knew these walls. The soft cream paint, the dark walnut wood, the oppressive portrait of that stern-faced woman hanging above the mantelpiece. She was inside the Moretti estate. The tragic lesson of running away is that our past always runs faster. Sophia, she whispered. Then she shouted, blind panic taking over. Sophia! The heavy door clicked open. Lorenzo stepped inside. He had changed into a clean white shirt, sleeves rolled up. His hair was still damp from a shower. He wore no expression on his face. He stood in the doorway, eyes locked onto her. The heavy silence hanging between them was louder than any screaming match could ever be. Elena's breath hitched. 5 long years. 5 exhausting years of imagining this terrifying collision. 5 years of dreading his shadow. 5 years of practicing excuses, convincing herself she would never have to use them. And now, her mind was blank. Sophia is fine, Lorenzo said, his voice steady. She is downstairs. She ate pancakes and made French fries with my housekeeper. That dog has not left her side. Elena exhaled. Her shoulders sagged under the massive weight of relief. Fear can bend us down, but the sudden release of it leaves us utterly shattered. Hot tears spilled down her cheeks. Lorenzo reached back and clicked the door shut. He stepped deeper into the room, stopping a few feet away, hands in his pockets. He looked at her with the exact eyes she had loved fiercely a lifetime ago. The same eyes she ran from in the dark. The eyes she gave to her daughter. Why did you disappear, Elena? He asked. His voice was dangerously soft. 5 years, he whispered. Not a phone call, not a letter, not a goodbye. She could not meet his gaze. Shame is an anchor that always drags our eyes to the floor. Lorenzo, please, she choked out. Sophia is mine, is she not? Elena's lips trembled. The tears fell faster now, a river of guilt. She gave him a devastating nod. I am sorry, she wept. I am so sorry. Lorenzo closed his eyes, absorbing the brutal confession. When Lorenzo finally opened his eyes, the armor he had worn for a lifetime was completely shattered. The cracked, raw emotion was right there on his face, and he wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Why didn't you tell me? he asked, his voice rough, scraping like sandpaper. Why did you let me believe for 5 long years that you simply didn't love me enough to stay? I had to protect her, Elena whispered. From what? He demanded.
From you, Lorenzo. The words tore out of her chest, a painful, bleeding apology. From the men with guns at the doors, from the meetings that end in body bags.
From the violent world you live in. She wrapped her arms around her own shoulders, shivering. I couldn't raise our little girl in a house where her first lesson was memorizing the flawed plan, just to survive a shootout.
I couldn't let her grow up knowing what her father really did for a living. Elena pleaded. I love you, that was never the question. The second I saw those 2 pink lines,
the story stopped being about us. It became about her, Lorenzo, the stir. You didn't trust me, he said quietly. Elena opened to her mouth. The dark truth about his mother, Isabella, sat right there on her tongue. The threats, the money, the cold instructions to disappear. But she swallowed it down. She had given her word. Lorenzo studied her face, waiting. When nothing came, a steel door closed over his expression. He turned Alice back and walked out. Sometimes, the heaviest burdens we carry are the painful truths we choose to swallow for someone else. His heart was tearing down the middle, but he could not, for the absolute life of him, find a way to be angry with her. Have you ever felt that kind of helpless heartbreak? You and I both know it changes a person. The morning came some soft and grey. Lorenzo had not slept a single wink. He stepped out into the damp garden just after dawn, a fresh cup of black coffee in his hand, his collar turned up against the sharp chill. The brutal storm had passed in the night, leaving the world washed clean and quiet. Mist drifted low across the lawn. He found the little rescue puppy curled up tight by the stone koi pond at the end of the property. Bandit was fast asleep in a rare patch of morning sunlight, his tiny black nose tucked safely under a paw. Someone had gently bathed him. The little dog's coat was clean now, showing off the rich tanned and black of a true Jude shepherd, though his ribs still showed through his painfully thin frame. A small white bandage was wrapped around his left front paw, right where the shattered glass had cut him during the rescue. Lorenzo lowered himself onto the coldstone bench beside the quiet pond and just stared at the sleeping animal. This was a hardened man who had spent 37 years refusing to shed a tear, but he found himself fighting them now, breaking down over a tiny creature that could fit inside his coat pocket. Hey, he murmured. Bandit's fuzzy ear twitched. If you hadn't run out in front of my car last night. Lorenzo's thick voice caught in his throat. He cleared it. I never would have found them. Did you know that? Bandit lifted his head, his dark, wise eyes, ancient eyes that simply did not belong in such a small body, settled onto Lorenzo's face. Then, in one quiet movement, the little puppy stood up, walked the few wobbly steps across the damp grass, and pressed his wet nose right into the center of Lorenzo's trembling palm. Lorenzo gently closed his thick fingers around that tiny head. Thank you, he whispered. A sudden patter of small footsteps broke the morning stillness. Mr. Lowe. Sophia came running across the lawn, wearing a borrowed sweater that was 2 sizes too big, the sleeves flopping past her hands. She clutched a chocolate chip cookie. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the cold. Can I give Bandit a treat? She asked breathlessly, skidding to a halt in front of him. Just a tiny piece. I promise I won't give him touch. The cook said it was okay. Lorenzo just nodded slowly. He was not entirely sure he could trust his own voice to speak. The little girl broke the cookie carefully into a small piece and held it out on her flat palm, exactly the way someone had clearly taught her. Bandit took it with the absolute gentlest mouth Lorenzo had ever seen on a dog. Sophia laughed, a high, bright sound that seemed to wake the whole garden as the puppy licked the sweet crumbs from her tiny fingers. She plopped down on the grass, right beside Lorenzo's heavy boots, folding her legs. "He was my big birthday present last year," she explained, happily scratching behind Bandit's perked ears. "My mommy got him from a nice lady in Wisconsin. He was so little back then." She held up two small fingers, barely an inch apart. "I had to feed him with a tiny bottle. Mommy told me he was here for protecting me." She tilted her face up to look at Lorenzo. "I think he's pretty good at his job, learned." Lorenzo's the little dog who had jumped through fire, storm, and broken glass to deliver a stranger to the only family he had left in this world. "Yeah," he said quietly, "he's pretty good at his job." Later, Lorenzo stood on the balcony with another coffee, watching his daughter chase the puppy around the rose hedges. The little dog circled back, ambushing her with a playful pounce that got her shrieking with pure joy. Bright, ringing laughter finally filled the cold, haunted gardens of the heavy Moretti estate. For the first time in more years than Lorenzo could count, the massive house didn't sound like a hollow tomb. Heavy steps approached from behind. It was Dante. He came to stand at the railing. Looking down at the same beautiful scene, he let a tense beat pass. It might be wise to be cautious. A woman and a child appearing out of nowhere at this point in the war with Venetti.
"She could be using you." Lorenzo did not turn his head. "Shut your mouth, Dante." His deep voice was quiet, but the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The first time in 20 years of loyalty.
Lorenzo Moretti was deeply annoyed with his right hand. Meanwhile, for 2 agonizing days, Isabella Moretti did not dare leave the lonely east wing of the house. She took all her silent meals alone in her private sitting room. She did not come down for breakfast or call for her afternoon coffee. She stayed behind closed doors, letting her son believe she was simply tired. But you and I know the truth. She was being eaten alive by her choices. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same image. A small girl asleep with a one-eyed bear under her chin. A grandchild who should have been calling her Nana for the past 5 years. A family she had cruelly stolen from herself. On the third bitter afternoon, Isabella finally forced herself to move. She wrapped a heavy shawl around her shoulders and made her agonizing way out toward the quiet rose garden, her private sanctuary for 40 long years. The roses were her late husband's gift. She tended them herself. No gardener was permitted to touch them. She sat on her usual weathered bench beneath the white pergola, surrounded by the last blooms of the dying season. She did not cry. She just sat still, letting the cold autumn air work on her face like a silent confession. Soft footsteps approached on the gravel path. Isabella turned, and little Sophia was standing at the edge of the rose beds and holding her stuffed bear by one paw. She was watching the older woman with wide, serious eyes, wearing a small pink coat with mismatched buttons. "Hello," Sophia said politely into the quiet garden. Isabella's breath caught sharply in her aching chest. She could barely manage a whisper. "Hello, child." Sophia took a brave step closer. She stopped a few feet away and tilted her head, studying Isabella's sorrowful face with the unflinching honesty only a 5-year-old could manage. "Why do you keep looking at me and then crying?" Isabella opened her mouth, then closed it. This was a powerful woman who had commanded senators and judges, a matriarch who made dangerous men twice her size lower their gaze. Yet, she had no answer for a sweet child in a pink coat. Sophia waited a patient moment. When no answer came, she did something highly practical instead. She climbed right up onto the bench beside Isabella, the old wood creaking softly under her small weight, and neatly arranged her stuffed bear on her lap. Mommy says, "When you feel sad, you should get a big hug," the little girl announced with absolute certainty. "Do you want me to give you a hug?" It was a simple offer, but something inside Isabella's chest, something ancient and stone-hard, simply shattered. She let out a wounded sound she had not made since the day her husband died. She pulled the little girl into her trembling arms, holding her like a broken woman, clinging to a piece of her own soul she thought was lost forever. Sophia hugged her back without hesitation, small arms wrapped securely around her neck, the stuffed bear pressed between their beating hearts. For a long, healing while, neither of them spoke. Then Sophia pulled back just a little, her cheek still resting against Isabella's shoulder, and began to talk in the soft, conversational way of children who do not yet know how heavy their words truly are. At our old apartment, sometimes Mommy would cry when she thought I was asleep. Sophia murmured. I asked her once why she was sad. She told me there was a mama somewhere who loved her son so much she just didn't want anybody else near him. Mommy said it wasn't a bad thing. She said it was just a sad thing. I didn't really understand. Isabella stopped breathing. Let that sink in. In 5 brutal years of struggle, of raising a child alone in a harsh city, Elena had never once spoken a single poisoned word about Isabella to her daughter, despite the cruel threats, despite the banishment. She chose grace instead of bitterness. Isabella desperately pressed her wet, ruined face beneath deep into Sophia's hair, so the instinct obedient, the absolute devastation wrecking her features. It is 11 at night, and the house is drowning in a heavy silence. Sophia gently pats her back the way you would soothe a fragile bird. I am so sorry, sweetheart, she whispers into the dark. Even little Bandit seems to understand, she says, because everybody cries sometimes. Across the room, Lorenzo stops pretending. He watched his mother all through dinner. He saw the way she refused to meet Elena's eyes, the way her hand trembled lifting her wine. That tender touch on Sophia's hairs was a prayer for forgiveness. He remembers the look on his mother's face the night they carried Elena in. It was not shock, it was recognition. We often forget this, but sometimes the ghosts we hide are sitting right across from us at the dinner table. Picture this. The house finally surrenders to the dark. Elena and the little girl are asleep upstairs, safe in the quiet. Lorenzo waits until the last of the staff fades away. He, down that long, heavy corridor to his mother's sitting room. One knock. Come in, mother, he says. We need to talk in my study. She follows, no protests. Inside, the room is a ghost town, lit only by a dying fire and green desk lamp. Lorenzo pours 2 fingers of whiskey, offering her nothing. He points to the leather chair. She sits, back rigid, 64 years of pride wrapped around her like armor. He's just standing by the fire. He looks at the woman who gave him life, but his eyes, they're the eyes of a man staring at a traitor in a boardroom. Mother, he says, his voice dangerously low. What did you do to Elena 5 years ago, he asks. The silence stretches out thick and suffocating. Isabella says nothing. Do not make me ask twice. And just like that, the iron matriarch breaks. Her shoulders tremble in the low light. A single tear falls, then another, until she hides her face in her trembling hands. I threatened her, she whispers to her palms, the sound barely carrying over the crackling fire.
I told her if she did not vanish, I would use every ounce of this family's power to crush her, her mother, her sister, that fragile little music school.
She confesses it all. She threatened to blacklist her in Chicago, to fake visa charges, to tear her life apart, piece by piece. The cruelty of a mother protecting a son who never asked for it. I said all of those terrible things, she weeps. The glass of whiskey stops dead halfway to Lorenzo's mouth. I gave her $500,000, Isabella chokes out. I told her to run. I told her she would never be anything but a dirty stain on the Moretti name. The explosion is instant. Lorenzo's fist comes down on the heavy wood desk like a hammer. The whiskey bottle jumps, falls, and shatters across the cold marble. The sweet, burning scent of alcohol fills the air. "Do you have any earthly idea what you took from me?" he demands, his voice trembling now. The composure is gone.
My wife, my daughter, 5 whole years, mother, stolen time. It is a ghost you can never catch, a thief that leaves you utterly bankrupt.
"Mother," he roars into the shadows. Lorenzo Moretti never shouts, but tonight the dam has burst. 5 years. She raised out a child completely alone in some cheap apartment I could have bought 100 times over. Sophia grew up thinking her father was in the ground. He looks at her, his heart laid completely bare.
I drank myself to sleep for a night, but leaving was not good enough for the only woman I ever loved.
And it was you. Isabella slides out of her chair. She does not just sit. She falls to her knees, the proud queen of the Chicago underworld, draped in black silk and pearls, kneeling in a puddle of cheap liquor and broken glass. "I thought you only wanted your money," she whispered into the dark.
I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong, Lorenzo.
"I have been wrong every day for 5 years," she weeps. "I am so sorry." Lorenzo cannot even look at her. He turns his back, walking out of the study, pushing through the heavy back doors into the freezing night. The Chicago wind is brutal. It is the kind of cold that sinks straight into your bones. He stands barefoot on the wet, frozen grass, and for the first time since he was a little boy, the boss of the city breaks down and cries. A soft shadow steps up beside him. His dog, Bandit, presses a warm head against his leg, saying nothing, understanding in everything. Meanwhile, miles away on the south side, inside the rusted skeleton of an abandoned meatpacking plant, 2 dark cars idle in the dead of night. The wind off Lake Michigan howls against the tin roof. Somewhere out there in the dark, a midnight freight train screams along the iron tracks. Inside the warehouse, under a single swaying yellow bulb, 2 men stand on opposite sides of a steel table. Dante Marino stands in his shirt sleeves, indifferent to the freezing draft. Across from him is Salvatore Vanzetti. Sal is 58, wrapped tight in dark wool and a charcoal scarf. His gold rings flash under the swinging light. He wears the kind of polite smile that has buried far better men than Dante. 2 musclemen wait by the heavy steel door, hands buried deep inside their coats. "You are completely sure about this?" Sal asks. "Lorenzo has been the most careful man in this city for 15 years. He has gone soft." Dante shakes his head. "He has gone human. It's much worse."
There is a woman, Dante says, his breath plumbing in the cold air. Elena Russo. He thought she was a ghost, but she is sitting in his house right now, upstairs with a 5-year-old girl, his daughter.
Sal's eyes narrow. The casual amusement fades, replaced by the cold hunger of a wolf smelling blood in the snow. "Well now," Sal murmurs, "that is a remarkably useful piece of information. They are his fatal weakness." Dante presses both hands flat against the freezing steel table. "I have waited in 20 years to find a single crack in his armor. Now I have 2. A muscle jumps in Dante's cheek. In his mind, the warehouse melts away. He is 14 again. He is watching his father step in front of a bullet meant for Lorenzo's father, bleeding out on cold concrete. They told that broken 14-year-old boy that his father died a hero. They promised the Moretti family would watch over him forever, and they did in their own twisted way. They gave him a pitiful allowance, a cramped apartment, and a job running dirty messages and illegal guns. They threw him scripts, letting him just sit at the edge of their long dining tables on holidays. He had to sit there and watch young Lorenzo grow up running through marble halls, while Dante went home to a freezing one-bedroom on the west side Jotai with a broken radiator. When the dust settled on their fathers' graves, Lorenzo inherited a sprawling empire. Dante inherited a choke chain. He learned to smile. He learned to bow. For 2 solid decades, he stood by Lorenzo and called him boss. Every single time that word left his lips, it tasted like bitter rust. Dante pulls himself back to the freezing room. My father died so the Morettas could keep breathing, Dante says, his voice barely a whisper. Now, it is their turn to bleed so the Merinos can finally live. Sal laughs softly, a dry, scraping sound. I have always liked you, my boy. You carry a poet's heart inside a soldier's bruised body. He reaches his hand across the table. Bring them all to me. The boss, the pretty woman, the little girl. When the smoke clears, the entire city of Chicago is yours. Dante stares at him. And what is your price? Sal smiles. Just the North Harbor, the shipping lanes. I am too old to want the whole world. I only want to die a very wealthy man. Dante takes the older man's hand. The grip is iron. When do we move? Sal asks. Too soon, Dante replies. He is paranoid now. He brought in fresh cameras, heavy guards, but there is always a window. A brief moment when he has to leave the grounds for business he cannot trust to anyone else. When that moment comes, I will be ready. Dante steps back, fading into the levee shadows beyond the swinging bulb. Patience, my friend. I have waited 20 years for this. Let me tell you something about vengeance. It is a fire that burns the house down just to kill a rat. Back at the grand estate, the night is heavy. Lorenzo slowly climbs the sweeping stairs to Elena's room. He carries no anger now, just a deep, bone-crushing exhaustion. She is sitting in bed, reading. She looks up as he steps into the doorway. Whatever question she was about to ask dies. She sees his eyes, so... I know, Lorenzo says, his voice entirely empty. The book slowly drops into her lap.
Sat in my study and told me everything tonight. Vicious threat she made to you. The way she made you feel like you were dirt on the bottom of her shoe. I know all of it.
Elena's eyes immediately fill with tears.
Lorenzo, please. I am not here to be angry with you. He steps forward and sits on the edge of the mattress. He leaves a careful, agonizing distance between them.
Like he is terrified his touch might shatter her into a million pieces. You do not have to carry this burden alone anymore, he says softly. Her breath catches in her throat. I promised her, Elena whispers, the tears finally breaking loose. I promised her I would never speak a word of it to you. I carried that secret for 5 long years. He stares at her, heartbroken. Why? He asks. Because I knew she loved you, Elena cries. I knew that one day you might find it in your heart to forgive her if she confessed. But if I was the one who tore your family apart, you would never forgive me. Lorenzo just looks at her. Slowly, delicately, he reaches out and takes her small hand in his. You carried the weight of the world, he says, his voice cracking in the midnight quiet. You raised a beautiful little girl in a tiny apartment while I sat in this massive marble tomb, drinking myself in a blind stupor every single night. You taught her to speak, he whispers. You watched her take her first steps without me. Elena closes her eyes. The grief she held back for 5 years washes over her. I never stopped loving you, she sobs. I was just so terrified that loving you would put a bullet in her chest. He cannot bear the space between them anymore. He pulls her gently against his chest. She collapses into his arms, finally allowed to rest. For a long, quiet hour, neither speaks. Finally, he stands up and offers his hand. "Come outside with me," he says gently. He leads her onto the grand stone balcony. The freezing night spreads out beneath them and stretching to the silver sweep of Lake Michigan. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is just stop running and let ourselves be loved. The moon hangs high and full tonight, casting shattered silver across the water. Lorenzo keeps her hand locked inside his own. "I am leaving the family business," he says, his voice thick with an exhaustion years in the making. She turns, searching his eyes. He promises her a clean way out, a legal path, though he knows it will demand careful, agonizing steps. "The first day I held our daughter in that wreckage," he confesses, "was the day the mob boss in me truly died." Elena warns him that men like him do not get to retire. They do not just walk away. But for the first time in his violently life, he has a reason to actually live. You and I know how love changes a man. It strips away the armor we thought we needed, leaving us completely bare, but finally truly awake.
Go, he whispers. Not for them, not for anyone. The moonlight catches the silver in her quiet tears. When he kisses her,
5 agonizing years of pain and mere survival shatter against that single, gentle touch. A few feet away, hidden behind a tall plant, a little girl in a borrowed nightgown and a puppy with a bandaged paw watch the whole thing. Sophia claps her hand over her mouth to swallow a giggle, while Bandit's dentail thumps against the stone. But peace never lasts long for those who live in the shadows. Just after sunrise, a frantic barking shatters the morning quiet. It is too furious for a creature that small. Lorenzo's is only half dressed when the violent sound reaches his open bedroom window. By the time Lorenzo steps onto the balcony, Bandit is at the front gate. All 4 paws are planted in the gravel, hackles raised, throat raw with a desperate warning. Inside, Sophia stands in her pink slippers, watching. Elena gently pulls her away from the glass, telling her to let Mr. Lorenzo handle it. He takes the stairs 2 at a time. Down in the dim security room, Marco freezes the overnight footage. 3:37 in the morning. A tall, hooded figure walks the perimeter wall. The shadowed pauses, studying the cameras, before vanishing into the trees. Lorenzo feels his blood turn to ice. Danger does not always roar when it arrives at your doorstep. More often than not, it simply watches and waits in the dark. "Run it back further," Lorenzo demands, dread tightening his chest. Marco screw the endless hours until 2 more sightings appear. Different nights, but the exact same patient, professional cases. Someone is studying the property, Marco says quietly. They are counting the guard shifts, finding every single blind spot. He suspects Vanzetti hired a freelancer. Whoever this ghost is, they are lethal. Lorenzo knows them. He orders the patrols doubled, to demand 2 men on the upstairs corridor. He wants unbroken eyes on Elena and Zelena, Sophia from sundown to sunrise. By the time Lorenzo walks back outside into the morning air, Bandit has finally stopped his barking. The hardest lesson a protector ever learns is that thick walls can only keep out the enemies you can actually see. The puppy is sitting at the base of the gate now. His ears are pinned forward, his body entirely rigid, staring down the empty gravel driveway as if he can see a phantom the cameras missed. Lorenzo crouches beside him. "Good boy," he murmurs, his voice heavy with gratitude. Bandit simply thumps his tail once without breaking his gaze. As the sun climbs, the household tries desperately to pretend it is just an ordinary morning. Sophia takes her bear to the library, asking Lorenzo to read a story. Out on the terrace, Elena sits carefully with Isabella. The older woman pours her tea, her hands trembling with a profound, unspoken apology. Lorenzo watches them from a distance. Guilt is a heavy stone to carry, and true forgiveness is a river that can take a lifetime to cross. That afternoon, Lorenzo crosses the grand foyer with the Sophia balanced safely on his hip. When Dante walks through the side door, taking off his heavy coat, the mood fractures. Bandit stops dead on the cold marble. A low, dangerous growl builds deep in his little throat. Sophia frowns, telling the puppy it is just Mr. Dante. But the growl only darkens. Dante flashes an easy, effortless smile. Smart Dog does not like new ceases, he says smoothly, taking a step closer. Bandit instantly shields Sophia, baring his tiny teeth.
Lorenzo watches with a cold calculation of around, noting a card he will need later. And he says nothing at all. Just a bit tighter, turns and walks away.
Always trust the instincts of the innocent. They often see the wolves we invite inside. Night falls, and the tension in the house thickens. Bandit refuses to sleep at the foot of Sophia's bed. Instead, the brave puppy lays his small body flat across the threshold of her door. His eyes remain wide open in the suffocating dark, his head lifting whenever a floorboard creaks in the corridor. Elena leans against her doorframe. "Do you see him?" she asks softly. "He feels something." Lorenzo nods, the weight of a violent world resting on his shoulders. He promises to tighten the cameras and the guards. Whoever is watching will not get a second chance. He crouches down, resting his hand gently on Bandit's head. "You are a better bodyguard than every man on my payroll," he whispers into the dark. "Loyalty cannot be bought with money. It is a devotion forged only in love." The puppy wags his tail exactly once, but his watchful eyes never leave the dark hallway. It is the next afternoon, at 4:15, when the illusion of safety finally shatters. Marco spent 2 grueling days combing the estate's communication logs, searching for a crack in their armor. He finds it buried 6 layers deep in the records, a single outbound call. It came from the landline in the East Wing study, dialing a number completely missing from the Moretti contact list. Marco runs the digits over and over. The number traces back to a private phone, registered to Auguste Celincini. "You and I are about to witness the hardest truth of betrayal. The dagger placed in your back is almost always held by someone who sat comfortably at your own dinner table."
The shell company leads straight to Salvatore Vanzetti, and that phone in the East Wing study, it belongs exclusively to Dante Marino. Marco feels his stomach turn to solid ice. He grabs his radio.
His voice frantic. "Boss, where are you?" Lorenzo answers over the speaker of his rushing SUV, saying he just finished downtown and is heading home. "Get back to the estate right now," Marco pleads, terror bleeding through the static. It is Dante. It has always been Dante." The line goes dead silent for one agonizing heartbeat before it completely cuts out. Lorenzo does not hesitate. He pushes his SUV past 70 on a quiet road, knuckles bone white on the steering wheel. The deepest cuts do not come from our bitter enemies. They come from the brothers we foolishly chose to trust. He dials the house line, nothing. He calls the gate. He tries Marco, but only empty ringing answers him. When the heavy SUV finally tears up the gravel driveway, Lorenzo's worst nightmare takes shape. The front gate is standing wide open. He steps out before the car even comes to a full stop. The massive front door is left ajar. Inside, the grand foyer feels deeply wrong. Not destroyed, but violently disrupted. An overturned chair, a knocked-over vase, and there, lying sideways on this old cold marble, is a single pink spot, the one little Sophia had been wearing. 2 of his men are slumped against the wall, breathing but paralyzed by professional tranquilizer darts. "Elena," Lorenzo roars, his agony tearing the house apart. but only a suffocating, terrifying silence answers him. He tears through the rooms like a desperate madman. The library is empty. The dining room doors are thrown open to the wind. In the kitchen, a half-finished cup of tea sits perfectly cold on the counter. His mother's room, the east wing, Sophia's bright bedroom all entirely empty. Lorenzo crashes back down into the rear foyer and freezes. A small, broken whimper echoes near the wall. He drops to his knees on the hard stone. Little Bandit is lying on his side at the base of the door. His coat is matted and smeared with thick blood. His back leg is bent at a sickening angle. He was kicked mercilessly by a man who did not care if the tiny creature lived or died. There is a special kind of darkness in this world. Cruelty to the truly defenseless is the ultimate mark of a coward's soul. Even shattered, the brave Popeye had moved, inch by agonizing inch, leaving a smear of crimson across the marble. Bandit dragged himself to the exact spot where his master would step when he came home. Clenched tightly between his small teeth is a torn scrap of black fabric, the exact wool Dante Marino always wore. A sound rips out of Lorenzo that no one has ever heard before. It is not a shout. It is something ancient, feral, and entirely animal. He rises from his knees and destroys the room. He flips the heavy oak table with his bare hands. He drives his fist straight through an antique mirror, sending a violent rain of shattered glass down upon the floor. Grief is simply love with nowhere left to go, and right now, his love is rapidly turning into pure, unstoppable violence. He does not feel the cuts on his knuckles. His phone vibrates. He stares at the glowing screen. Dante. He answers without uttering a single syllable. Boss. Dante's voice drifts through the speaker, chillingly calm.
Navy Pier, midnight. Warehouse 14. By morning, your family will be floating down the Chicago River. Lorenzo does not give him the satisfaction of an answer.
He simply ends the call. He sinks back down onto the ruined marble floor and pulls the trembling dog gently into his lap. His hands shake as he presses his coat against the terrible wound. You fought to the end, he whispers, heavy tears finally breaking his weary voice. You fought to the very end. Thank you. True heroes rarely wear armor. Sometimes they just have 4 paws and a loyal heart, far too big for this vicious world. Bandit lifted his head, shivering from the cold shock of his wounds, and dragged a wet tongue across Lorenzo's face. It was a silent, desperate plea to save them. Dr. Hartwell arrived within the hour, carrying the broken little creature down into the sterile quiet of the lower infirmary. The pub whined once when Lorenzo set him on the steel table, then fell completely silent. Those dark, trusting eyes never left Lorenzo as the heavy door clicked shut. Down in the war room, Lorenzo smoothed a map of the Chicago waterfront over a long oak table. He gathered only the absolute loyal. Old Vincent, who had bled for his father, Tomas. 12 men in total, who won't spend a single second with alone when Dante. You and I know that loyalty is rare, but true loyalty is always forged in the fires of shared grief. They stood around that heavy table in absolute silence, the air with impending violence. This is no longer a question of the syndicate, Lorenzo told them, his voice an eerie, perfectly steady baritone. The frantic grief was gone, locked away in a dark room of his mind where he could bleed later. This is a question of my blood, my mother, my woman, my daughter. They are freezing at Navy Pier because Dante has planned this betrayal for 20 years and Salvatore has waited 10. Tonight, we bury them both. He tapped the map at Warehouse 14. He told me to come alone. I will arrive exactly as asked. Marco?
I need 12 ghosts around that parameter before 11.
Snipers on the garage roof. 2 on the freight crane. The lesson here is seems Sometimes you must walk into the darkest cave alone to protect the light. 3 teams on the ground, wrapped in heavy waterproof gear. No radios tonight, he ordered, just hand signals in the dark. When I slip my coat off my shoulders, that is the green light. Marco nodded. Understood, boss. Lorenzo stared down every man in the room. If anyone pulls a trigger before my coat falls, my women die. Is that clear? The men nodded, scattering into the shadows to prepare. Lorenzo climbed the stairs one last time to check on the dog. Bandit lay on a soft blanket, his back leg in a stiff splint, his ribs bound. The medication was trying to pull him under, but the moment the door swung open, the pup fought his way up. No, Lorenzo whispered, pressing a heavy hand to his fur. Not this time. You and I must learn that true love often means forcing the ones you care about to stay behind. The little dog let out a sharp, fractured whine, pawing desperately at Lorenzo's hand. He tried to stand on 3 legs, his frail body giving out as he collapsed onto the blanket. I know, Lorenzo whispered into the quiet room, pressing his forehead against the dog's warm, trembling brow. I know you want to come, but you did your part, my brave boy. Now let me do mine. When Lorenzo walked out, the agonizing howl of the pup echoed down the empty corridor. Miles away, in the damp, windowless belly of Warehouse 14, Elena sat shivering on cold concrete. Her wrists were bound tight behind her back. Beside her, Isabella sat strapped to a folding chair, her chin held defiantly high. Sophia pressed her tiny frame against her mother. The tragedy of this life is that the innocent always pay the toll for the sins of the fathers. Salvatore walked into the damp room wearing the arrogant, loose smile of a man who believed he had finally won.
Isabella, he purred, the false warmth dripping from his tone. It has been years.
You have edged. Isabella did not so much as flinch. I have faced much worse men than you, Salvatore, she said, her voice like grinding stone, and I have buried them. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, mock nod, but before he turned away, over by the rusted door stood Dante. His arms were crossed tight, his face a terrifying blank canvas. He refused to look at the women. He only stared at the iron frame, waiting for Lorenzo. Elena leaned down, pressing her bruised cheek into Sophia's soft hair. Listen to me, my brave girl, she whispered in the dark. Daddy is coming. Never lose hope, because hope is the only true light we have in the dark.
Sophia gave a tiny, fierce nod, her small chin tilted up, and those wet, crystal blue eyes, Lorenzo's exact eyes, were shining with an impossible certainty. I know, Mommy,
she whispered back into the shadows.
Dad told me.
By 11:45, Lorenzo's black sedan rolled to a quiet halt at the heavy iron gates. The rain had started up again. It was that bitter, relentless cold rain that falls straight from the black sky, asking if you remember your oldest regrets. He stepped out into the freezing downpour, and for a fleeting second, he was 26 again.
Holding a discarded key outside.
An empty apartment.
He shoved the ghost of that memory away. Tonight he was taking his life back. He walked through those cavernous warehouse doors with empty hands.
The greatest courage any man can show is walking unarmed into the storm for love. The massive interior was soaked in the harsh, unnatural glare of industrial floodlights. Towers of rusty shipping containers loomed like canyon walls in the gloom. Salvatore stood dead center in a long black coat, flanked by 30 heavily armed soldiers. Dante shadowed him like a ghost, and there, against the far concrete wall, bruised but breathing, were the 3 women. Lorenzo's dark eyes locked onto his little girl for one agonizing second. He let the crushing weight of his love wash over him, then buried it deep beneath the ice of what he had to do. Boss, Dante's voice echoed the damp concrete. You actually came alone. I almost respect that. Lorenzo did not break stride. "I came as I promised." Dante drew his weapon, holding it loose. The past never truly dies until you look it right in the eye and refuse to blink. 5 years ago, you would have stormed in here and emptied this entire room by yourself. Dante sneered, his voice dripping with twisted pity. Now you are just soft, boss. Soft for a woman, soft for a little girl. It hurts to even watch. Lorenzo stood perfectly still as ice-cold rainwater ran from the ends of his hair.
"You spent 20 years feeding a bitter hatred that you somehow mistook for justice," he replied, his voice a low thunder. "And I spent 5 years grieving a woman I should have fought for."
"We are both fools, Dante, but tonight I stopped being one." A strange, fractured guilt flickered across Dante's face before he masked it with pure rage and raised his gun. Lorenzo simply lifted his right hand to his collar, gripping the heavy fabric, and let his coat fall to the floor. Action always speaks the final truth when words fail. 3 chaotic things happened in the exact same heartbeat. A fatal red dot bloomed across the chest of the gunman. On Salvatore's left, the man collapsing before the thunder of the shot even echoed. A brilliant flash from the wet rooftop scaffolding erased the second sniper hiding high up in the rafters. Then Marco's elite strike team breached the side doors and the loading bay in perfect synchronization. 12 ghosts, moving in absolute, lethal silence, their rifles spitting fire. The cavernous room shattered into madness, muzzle flashes cutting through the sudden cloud of concrete dust. Men screaming in 3 different languages as heavy bullets shrieked off steel shipping crates. But Salvatore did not dive for cover. Instead, the coward turned his weapon directly toward the bound women. True monsters reveal themselves when the walls close in.
"Mommy." Sophia's terrified scream tore through the deafening gunfire. Without a single thought, Elena threw her own frail body across her little girl, a brave, desperate human shield.
But Isabella had been quietly grinding her bound wrists against the sharp edge of the chair for an entire hour. In that one fractured second of time, the bloody ropes finally gave way. A 64-year-old woman in pearls and a black silk dress ripped her hands free. The concrete faster than she had ever moved in her long life. She collided with Elena and Sophia a millisecond before Salvatore pulled the trigger. 2 deafening cracks, 2 hollow points to the center of Isabel's chest. She jerked violently, but her arms only locked tighter around Jean as she crumpled to the floor. A mother's sacrifice is the heaviest debt of all. An unearthly, guttural roar ripped from Lorenzo's throat, a sound empty of language, built only on raw agony. He raised his heavy pistol and fired 3 times, mechanical, flawless, every round striking dead center. Salvatore was a corpse before his knees even kissed the wet concrete. Almost immediately, the warehouse fell into a strange, suffocating silence as the remaining soldiers realized their boss was dead. Dante spun on his heels, desperate to vanish into the smoke, but Marco stepped out of the shadows, blocking the exit with a leveled rifle. Lorenzo sprinted across the littered floor, dropping violently to his knees. He slid a trembling arm under his mother, lifting her from the cold ground. Blood was already ruining the black silk. We never realize the true weight of our parents until we have to carry them in our arms. "Mother," he begged, his voice cracking down the middle. "Look at me." Her heavy eyelids slid open, finding his face in the gloom. And then she smiled. It was the exact same gentle, reassuring smile she gave him when he was 7 years old, wiping the dirt from his scraped knees in the old estate gardens. Her pale hand wandered blindly through the air until Elena caught it, holding it tight against her own tears. My child, Isabella whispered, her breath rattling. I was so wrong about you. You are the absolute best thing that ever happened to this dark family. Please, forgive me. Elena was sobbing openly now. There is nothing to forgive, she wept. Isabella turned her fading eyes back to her son. I am here, Mama, Lorenzo choked out. I have always loved you, she whispered. Build a real family. Forgiveness is the only bridge that spans death. Do not let my bitter mistakes haunt this house. For another Oscar's exhausted gaze drifted down to the terrified girl shivering by her side. With the very last of her fading strength, she lifted a trembling hand and pressed it to Sophia's wet cheek. My little princess, Isabella breathed, her voice barely a ghost in the vast room. Grandma loves you so much. Be brave, be kind, be everything I was always too afraid to be. Sophia buried her face into the warmth of her grandmother's palm, just as the old woman's hand finally went limp. Her chest rose, and then it settled into absolute stillness. Lorenzo, who had lowered his heavy brow onto his mother's shoulder, grief is simply the final, agonizing proof of a profound love. For a long, suffocating minute, the warehouse was entirely motionless. Then the harsh scrape of heavy boots broke the silence. Marco marched forward out of the smoke. His rifle barrel jammed aggressively into the back of the man, stumbling ahead of him. Dante's wrists were tightly bound with plastic zip ties. A fresh stream of blood trailing down his temple from a vicious rifle strike. Marco forced the traitor to his knees, just 3 feet from where Isabella's body lay. Lorenzo rose to his feet with a terrifying slowness, laying his mother gently on the Aldertone. He walked over, towering over the boy who used to be his absolute best friend. Dante's face twisted in an ugly mask of spite. My father died for your family, he spat venomously. He bled out on a floor just like this. He gave his entire life for yours. We reap what our fathers sow, don't we? And what did I get? Dante sobbed. Crumbs, pity, a tight leash. I deserved the empire they handed to you. Lorenzo stared down at him. Your father chose to sacrifice himself, he answered softly. That was his personal honor. You took his noble gift and twisted it into venom inside your soul. That is your burden, no one else's. Dante's lips curled in sick anticipation. He closed his eyes, waiting for the execution. But the bullet never came. You and I know that breaking a cycle of violence requires unimaginable strength. Lorenzo slowly turned his back. Marco, call Detective Reyes, he ordered. Tell her we have Salvatore's corpse, his hitman, and the mastermind. She gets the credit. Marco nodded silently, while Lorenzo left his old friend to rot. What do I had? Lorenzo snarled. Now you'll live in a cell and learn what it actually feels like to lose everything. Dante opened his mouth, but didn't get to speak. A tiny voice cut through the violent tension. Daddy? Lorenzo froze. Sophia was standing by the open warehouse doors, shivering in the cold rain. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, her little hand reaching out. Daddy, Daddy. She had never called anyone that word before. Lorenzo let his dark vengeance die right there on the floor. He cruised all the room in 3 strides, dropped heavily to his knees, and pulled his weeping daughter and his Lelena fiercely into his arms. Because in the end, true strength isn't measured by the revenge we take, but by the family we finally choose to protect. You and I both know that true redemption always carries a heavy price. Out under the open sky, the unforgiving Chicago storm washed over them, a brutal baptism by rain. Let us skip ahead 6 months. Spring had finally warmed Lake Forest. The bitter frosts abandoned the gardens, and the towering iron gates of the Moretti estate shut tight for two bloody generations now swung open freely. Lorenzo Moraffiti was no longer the boss of any business settled with a bullet. In the quiet months following that harrowing night, he stood before rooms of dangerous men who used to tremble at his shadow. He offered them a clean way out. Anyone willing to leave the violent life would be supported, retrained, and given a chance at an honest, quiet living. The men who hung under the shadows were free to walk away, the dropping the Moretti name forever to try their dark luck elsewhere. Most chose the light. The infamous Moretti gun vaults were stripped, transformed into dusty archives. The fake shipping front morphed into a genuine hard bar leet. All the dirty money was buried beneath legal mazes, so deep it would take lifetimes to unearth it. Lorenzo paid for this peace in millions of dollars, and in sheer pride, he never regretted a single second of it. The sprawling estate had transformed, too. It was beautifully loud now. A small girl in a bright yellow dress sprinted across the vibrant lawn, screaming with pure joy, chased relentlessly by a half-grown German shepherd whose floppy ears had finally matched his massive head. That brave dog Bandit was twice the size he had been 6 months ago. He was lean and powerful, his coat shimmering in the sun, the heartbreaking limp from his shattered leg now that nothing but a faded memory. He skidded to a halt, letting Sophia catch her breath before bolting away again, checking over his shoulder to ensure his always high tiny human was safe. Nearby, in the rose garden, Elena knelt beside a freshly turned bed of dark soil. Years ago, Isabella had spent endless hours trying to breed a delicate, pale yellow, climbing rose before her passing. Those fragile notes had been discovered in her old desk, written in her careful script. Elena took up that quiet mantle. Today, she was gently planting the final cuttings beneath a pristine white marble headstone. Under that cool stone rested the late head matriarch of the Moretti bloodline. The carved letters read, "A mother who learned the true meaning of love in her final moments." Lorenzo's strolled out into the quiet garden, handing a warm mug of coffee to Elena. For a long while, they stood shoulder to shoulder, watching their little girl tumbling through the grass. "You know," Lorenzo murmured, his voice thick with reflection, "to this day I cannot figure out why I got out of my car that night. That dog was just another stray in the gutter. The logical move was to keep driving there. Dante begged me to ignore him. Every hardened survival instinct I possessed screamed to stay in the dark, and yet I pushed the door open." Elena just smiled softly, keeping her gaze on the roses. Sometimes our souls recognize exactly what we need long before our brains catch up. Because your heart knew something your mind refused to see," Elena replied. Suddenly, small feet hammered across the lawn.
"Daddy, Mommy." Sophia skidded to a halt, Bandit panting happily at her heels. "Daddy, Bandit told me he wants a friend. Can we get one more dog?"
Lorenzo let out a deep, rumbling laugh, the warm, easy sound of a man who had finally shed his armor and found the father he was always meant to be. "Anything my princess desires." As evening settled, the four of them sat on the weathered stone steps leading down to Lake Michigan. The dying sun painted the water in ribbons of gold and pale rose. Sophia tucked herself against her mother, and Elena rested her head on Lorenzo's shoulder. The bandit stretched across all of their feet, eyes half closed in contentment. He was resting exactly where he had earned the right to be. It is a beautiful truth that the greatest heroes often arrive in the smallest bodies. A shivering puppy did not merely pull a woman and a child from a freezing ravine. He saved an entire family that was inches away from losing its soul forever, because genuine love, no matter how far it wanders, always finds its way back home. My friends, life has an agonizing way of testing us in the cruelest moments. We lose people. We make brutal choices we cannot undo. We let toxic pride speak louder than grace, and we suffer the silence. But I want you to hold on to this truth tonight. It is never too late to choose your family. It is never too late to stop and listen when a small, quiet voice begs you to change direction. And it is never too late to turn around and comfort to the people who have spent their lives waiting for you. If this late-night tale struck a chord inside your chest, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Hit the like button and share the story with someone who needs a reminder tonight that pure goodness still breathes in this cold world. Your support is the reason we share these heartfelt stories with you
every single day. And honestly, has there ever been a moment when a wounded animal, a total stranger,
or a heavy feeling in your gut told you to stop? What happened when you finally listened? And share your truth in the comments below. You never know who might be scrolling in the dark looking for a sign. Your honest words might be the exact lifeline another weary soul desperately needs to read tonight. So please, do not hold back. From my quiet studio to wherever you are listening in the world right now, I am wishing you all deep, enduring health, incredibly peaceful days, and a spirit overflowing with the kind of love that actually stays. Please take real care of the precious people you still have beside you. Do not a single breath for granted. Life is far too fragile for that. When this video ends, go find your people. Look them in the eyes and hold them just a little bit tighter tonight. This story is deeply meaningful because it shows how love, regret, betrayal, and redemption can all begin with one small act of compassion. Lorenzo Moretti is introduced as a powerful, emotionally frozen mafia boss, a man who has trained himself not to feel after losing Elena 5 years earlier. Yet when a tiny German shepherd puppy stands in the middle of a stormy highway and begs for help, Lorenzo makes one decision that changes everything. He stops. That moment teaches that even the hardest heart can still recognize a cry for help. The first lesson is that compassion should never be dismissed as weakness. Dante tells Lorenzo to keep driving, as treating the puppy as a possible trap and an inconvenience. But Lorenzo listens to something deeper than fear. Because stops, he saves Hesinas, Sophia, and the puppy PE. In real life, many meaningful turn-points being polygamity by noticing what others ignore and choosing kindness when indifference would be easier. Another powerful lesson is about hidden truth. For 5 years, Lorenzo believes Elena left because she did not love him enough. Elena believes she had to disappear to protect her daughter from Lorenzo's dangerous world. Later, the truth is revealed. Isabella, Lorenzo Fest's mother, threatened Elena and forced her away. This shows how secrets and manipulation can destroy families. When people make decisions based on fear, pride, or control, innocent people suffer for years. Elena's choice also teaches about motherhood and sacrifice. She raises Sophia alone, not because she wants to hurt Lorenzo, but because she believes protecting her child matters more than her own happiness. Whether or not her decision was perfect, her motivation is deeply human. The story reminds viewers that parents often make painful choices in silence, carrying burdens others may never understand. Lorenzo's transformation is one of the strongest educational parts of the story. Discovering Sophia does not simply make him emotional. It forces him to re-evaluate his entire life. He realizes that power, fear, and revenge are meaningless if they cost him his family. His decision to leave the criminal world shows that real strength is not holding on to violence forever. Sometimes true strength is choosing peace even when pride tells you to stay powerful. Bandit, The puppy, Wounds, becomes the heart of the story. He is small, wounded, and voiceless, yet he saves everyone.
This teaches that heroes do not always look strong. Sometimes courage comes from the smallest and most vulnerable beings.
It is action, not size or status.
The betrayal by Dante also teaches that resentment can poison a person over time. Instead of healing from his father's death, Dante turns pain into hatred. His story warns viewers that unresolved bitterness can turn loyalty into destruction.
For viewers, the deepest lesson is this: do not ignore small cries for help. Do not let pride separate you from love, and do not wait until tragedy forces you to value your family. Sometimes coming home begins with stopping in the rain, listening to the smallest voice, and choosing compassion over fear.